My mornings used to sound like the harbor, ropes creaking, gulls gossiping, the kettle humming as if it remembered every winter it kept me from breaking. That day, the sound was a lock I didn't recognize. I twisted my old brass key in the front door of my father's house and felt it catch on new metal. The key wouldn't turn. On the other side of the glass, a yellow notice fluttered against the pane like a trapped moth. A text came in from my brother while the kettle still warmed my palm. "Don't make this harder, Mara," he wrote. "You know you're not family. I've changed the locks." I stared at the words until they blurred and the harbor folded into a single gray swath. My name is Marana Dove, though everyone calls me Mara. I had survived the year of hospitals and quiet goodbyes, navigated the loamy sadness of losing our father, and learned the creases of probate papers like a second skin. But this was a new language, one where the person who grew up sharing your birthday cake uses you as a boundary instead of a sister. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass. Inside, I could see the hallway runner like a river leading back to the rooms where our father collected postcards and clocks and the kind of chairs no one sits in. The smell of cedar that always lived in the entry still reached me through the window seam, faint and insistent. Home drifted an arm's length away. I tried calling Luca. He let it ring. The yellow paper, stapled at each corner, announced authorized entry only, and the name of a property management company I didn't recognize. A woman from the bungalow across the street stepped onto her porch with a watering can and gave me that look people reserve for awkward dramas that happen in daylight, almond eyes skimming, mouth sympathetic but committed to its own garden. I lifted my hand in a half-wave, and the watering can moved on. It didn't start here, not really. It started months back, in a conference room that was too cold, with a lawyer who offered tissues like they were biscuits. "The house will pass to both of you," she said, "unless there's a valid challenge." Luca had smiled, a thin curve that remembered better days. "There won't be," he'd said, and he squeezed my hand under the table, his thumb tracing the knuckle we broke falling off our bikes the summer we learned to ride without fear. But grief has a way of pulling old knots tight. After the funeral, people showed up with questions and dishes, and someone told Luca, quietly, with that brand of sincerity that always comes late, that our father had once spoken the word adoption near my name. It wasn't new to me. I knew the rumor like I knew the cracks in the kitchen tile. Our mother used to say love is older than blood, and I grew up believing that truth was a space you live in, not a certificate you hang on the wall. My father never made me doubt it. Still, the doubt had found Luca. The metal of the lock trembled when I tried one last time. My key, the one that lived on a leather fob with a scallop shell, didn't fit this house anymore. I let it dangle and listened to the harbor. The gulls were louder than usual, or maybe the silence inside the house made them sound that way. I walked around to the back gate. The low fence had always been the kind of barrier you could step over if you trusted your shoes. The gate rattled open. In the yard, the quince tree leaned toward the sun, branches fretting with leaves. I pressed my fingers into the soil beneath it where, last spring, Luca and I buried our father's old wristwatch because he said he liked the idea of time growing sweet. The earth felt cool and damp, forgiving. Through the kitchen window, I could see the copper pot where my father taught me to make fish stew, his handwriting on the recipe card propped like a little sail. A shadow crossed the window. "Luca." He stood there a moment, then lifted the corner of the blinds. Our eyes met. For a heartbeat, 30 years of shared language hovered between us. "Don't tell Mom. What should we watch? Do you think it will rain?" He let the blind fall without a word. I could have shouted. Instead, I took out my phone and opened the last email from the lawyer. "We will proceed with filing, but I encourage you both to pursue mediation." My thumbs wanted to type. He changed the locks. He said I'm not family. He put a notice in the window like I'm a trespasser in my own childhood. Instead, I wrote, "Please confirm next step." The air smelled like salt and lawn. I sat on the back steps with my hands in my pockets until the sun tilted and the gulls grew bored. When I finally stood, I pressed my palm to the kitchen glass. "I live here," I said plainly. The glass didn't care. The house didn't answer. The lock did what it was made to do. On the walk back to my apartment, I passed the pharmacy where our father liked to thumb the greeting card rack for phrases that didn't sound like apologies. I remembered one card he bought for me when I was 10, a sailboat and the words, "You belong any place you love." Back then, it felt like a blessing. Now it felt like a compass I'd misplaced. By the time I turned the kettle in my own kitchen, the harbor had moved from my ears to my chest. The first boil coughed a cloud against the window. I touched the chain at my throat, the tiny silver locket with a photo inside, my father with his hairline a little farther back and me in a red raincoat. I took it off and laid it on the counter like an anchor you set where the tide can't reach. Then I opened my laptop and began to search for the only thing that might cut through rumors and locks, the truth with paper behind it. The email from the lawyer arrived at 8:17 a.m. "We can move to a motion for temporary access," she wrote, "but the court will want reasons. Documentation. If Luca is alleging you were not legally or biologically your father's child, we'll need to address it head-on." Head-on. It sounded like a lesson from the harbor: face the swell, don't let it catch you sideways. That day stretched long and thin. I went to work and tried to make sentences in other people's reports, editing commas that looked like fishhooks. At lunch I couldn't swallow. The air conditioner's hum trembled like a flaw in a glass. I took a walk down to the pier and watched a boy with a net try to catch the glint of something he couldn't name. He laughed when the net came up empty, as if the trying was victory enough. I was not a child, and this was not a game. What I risked losing pressed against my ribs from all sides: the house, yes, the swale of the living room ceiling where I once hid glow-in-the-dark stars, the studio at the back where my father measured fabric for sales and told me stories that had wind in them. But beneath the shingles and floorboards was something the court couldn't hold up and weigh, the surname I carried without asterisks, the way the town's older women tilted their heads and said, "You have your father's eyebrows," and I let them believe it because I wanted to live inside that belonging without correcting anybody. At home, I kept the photo boxes stacked like a small city against the wall. I opened the one I had avoided, the one my mother labeled with a stern, tidy hand, "Early Years." Our mother, Elise, was a woman who baked grief into pies and handed slices to anyone who showed up. She died when I was 16, and sometimes it still feels like she's in the next room holding a dish towel and humming off-key. If anyone knew the full sentence of my origin story, it was her. The box smelled faintly of library and dust. A birth announcement lay on top, paper thick enough to make a promise. "Welcome, Marana Dove." The date. The weight. No father named, just a space where a line might have been. I turned a pile and found an old letter tucked like a bookmark. It was addressed to my mother in a hand I didn't recognize. "Elise," it began. "I know the paper wants lines and signatures. But love is a room we built and lived in. If one day the lines matter, I will show up." No name at the bottom. The postmark was local, years before my birth. I remembered questions I never asked plainly, half curious, half afraid. My father, my true father in every way that counted, never shied from them. "Your mother and I wanted you more than bread," he'd say when I skirted near the edge. Then he'd tap my forehead with one finger and say, "Whatever the paperwork, you got this from me," and leave me to wonder what exactly this meant. While I sat with the photos, my phone lit with messages from friends who'd heard variations of the story. They used words like unfair and lawsuit and "I'm so sorry." I read them, grateful and bruised. I typed back, "It'll be okay," because I worried that if I wrote the thing I feared, that I might not be anyone's in the way that counts on forms, the letters would rearrange themselves and become true. At dusk, I walked to the house again, this time without trying the door. The porch light came on automatically, a glow my father set to welcome our return from night sales. Through the window, I saw Luca at the dining table with piles of papers around him. He ran a hand over his hair, that same nervous pat he did before exams. He looked up, caught me shadowed by the hydrangeas, and didn't look away. The distance between us was about 12 feet and a different universe. I lifted my palm. After a minute, he lifted his too. The blinds closed. The porch light stayed on, a little murky circle in the sea of dark. That night I dreamed the house had taken to sea, shingles for scales, windows like eyes. I swam after it with the locket in my teeth. When I woke, my jaw ached. In the morning, I spoke to the lawyer. "He's contesting," she said. "He claims you were never legally adopted, and that you were not biologically your father's child. He's asking the court to remove you as a beneficiary and grant him sole possession of the house due to urgent preservation needs." Urgent preservation. As if care were a deed you could waive. "I have his last will," I said quietly. "He named us both." "Wills can be contested," she said gently. "But facts do not evaporate because someone's pain is loud." Then she added, almost motherly, "We'll need your birth certificate. Any adoption records. And if you're willing, a DNA test that could show relation to your father's family." The thought of swabbing my cheek to prove I deserved to own the smell of cedar and the curve where sunlight slid every morning, it made something old and childlike sit up inside me and cry no. But it also made the compass jump toward north. I agreed. The lab kit arrived 2 days later, swaddled in instructions that read like an airplane safety card. I followed them carefully, set the sample in its little sleeve, and slid it into the mailbox. The woman at the post office stamped it like a blessing. I called my aunt, my father's sister, who lived 2 towns north in a cottage that always smelled like rain. We hadn't spoken since the funeral. Grief makes hermits of the best of us. When she answered and I asked if she'd be willing to test too, her yes was instant and unadorned. "Your father kept a note under the sugar tin," she said. "I forgot until just now. Come tomorrow. We'll get the test done and you can read what he left." After we hung up, I sat on the edge of my bed and let the harbor inside me settle. What I risked wasn't just a house. It was the right to keep the story I'd been living long enough that it had my footprints worn into it. I thought of Luca's face, how tired it looked, how determined. I didn't want to tear him down. I wanted to anchor both of us to something that wouldn't move when the wind changed. I pulled the locket's thin chain through my fingers until it warmed. "Love is older than blood," my mother had said. But sometimes blood is the quietest way to end an argument that threatens to drown everyone. I folded the adoption rumor back into its paper and slid it into a drawer. Tomorrow I would drive north to the cottage that smells like rain. Tomorrow I would ask my aunt to lend me her cheek. Tomorrow I would lift the sugar tin. My aunt's cottage leaned into a hill, with shingles gone soft with weather. Inside, everything was clean in the way of people who have learned how to suffer without mess. Books in stacks, a pie cooling under a mesh dome, the radio low enough to pretend the news belonged to somewhere else. She hugged me once and for a long time. When we sat at her kitchen table, she set a white box between us like a small cake. "Your father's last hiding place," she said, tapping the sugar tin beside it. The DNA kit for relatives was as precise and simple as mine had been. We read the instructions twice, not because we doubted, but because rituals matter. She swabbed her cheek and smiled as if this were ordinary, like lending a jacket or a recipe. "Your father loved you without footnotes," she said, sealing the envelope. "But he also loved order. He knew what whispers can do to a girl." Under the sugar tin lay a folded letter with the old man's beloved fountain pen loops. The paper had been misted by a spill at some point, the ink held. "To whoever finds this with Mara," it began, and the rush of my name from his handwriting struck me like a breeze through a hot room. By the time it matters, I will not be around to answer. I will set down 3 truths. 1. I chose Mara as my daughter every day I woke. 2. I failed to put as many papers around this choice as the world prefers. 3. I once heard a rumor that would hurt her if it grew teeth. If there is a day when teeth show, you will find the name of my friend and attorney in the envelope with this letter. He holds a codicil and instructions. More importantly, he holds no patience for those who mistake fear for fact. E. Dove. My aunt lifted a small envelope wedged behind the letter and passed it to me. A card slid out with a name, Oliver Raj, attorney at law, and a number stamped in tidy ink. I blinked at it, weirdly relieved to see a name I didn't know. Grief begets too many familiar faces. We mailed my aunt's sample and then drove in her small sedan along the coast to Oliver's office. It occupied the 2nd floor of a building above a florist, the air sweet with roses strong enough to make you forget any ugliness downstairs. Oliver was younger than I expected, sleeves rolled, kind in that understated way that allows space for your own voice. He poured water into glasses without asking and set one by my hand as if all clients arrived dehydrated. He opened a file like a door. Your father gave me this 2 years ago, he said. He told me not to complicate his simple wish while he lived. He wanted his house to continue to feel like a house. But he anticipated conflict after his death. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. Inside was a codicil to the will, not a reallocation of sums but a set of instructions like a careful recipe. If, in the course of probate, anyone alleged that I was not his legal or biological child, the executor was to request an avuncular DNA test with his sister, my aunt, and accept its results as sufficient rebuttal. He added that malicious interference, defined by false statements made in legal filings with reckless disregard, would trigger a clause redirecting a discretionary portion of personal property away from the accuser for a period of 1 year, to be held in a community trust for maritime apprenticeships he loved to sponsor. It's not disinheritance, Oliver said, reading my face. It's a break. Your father believed in pauses more than punishments. He knew Luca, my aunt murmured, brushing a crumb from her sweater that wasn't there. Oliver handed me another paper, thinner and clinical. There's a lab report here from 8 years ago, he said. A paternity test between you and your father wasn't possible then. Your mother had passed. He didn't want to force anything, but he did something adjacent. He tested himself against a swab he took from your baby book, your first lost tooth. It's not considered definitive in the strictest sense because of potential contamination, but science called it highly consistent with a paternal relationship. He didn't file it legally because he feared what it would do to the quiet of your adolescence. He asked me to hold it as a map, not a verdict. I read the words until they lifted off the page and became the feeling of my father's hand on my shoulder at 16, the soft and stubborn pressure that said, I'm here. I ran a finger over the lab's watermark. Proof that looked like paper but felt like breath. Will any of this change the house being locked to me? I asked. Oliver's eyes softened. In the short term, we'll get an emergency hearing for access. In the long term, we'll rely on the test with your aunt. Luca's filing cites gossip. The court prefers facts. On the drive back, the water crumpled the sky into light. We passed our harbor, boats tucked like commas into their berths. At home, I opened the baby book I had avoided touching for years because it made me ache with a variety of nostalgia I wasn't ready to entertain. There it was, the envelope with my tooth, a little ivory comma sealed in tape. I imagined my father, hands shaking the way they did when he tried to thread needles, choosing science as love because words sometimes break. 3 days later, the lab notified us that results were ready. I sat very still at my kitchen table, the scent of strong tea curving through the room like a rope. The report said, probability of avuncular relationship between Marana Dove and subject, paternal aunt 99.5%. The next line translated probability into common speech, extremely supportive of the hypothesis that Marana Dove is the biological child of the brother of the tested aunt. I forwarded it to Oliver. My finger hovered above Luca's name, the one that still auto-filled my favorites, and then I pressed send there too. A minute later, the typing bubbles appeared and disappeared, a small storm in a small cloud. His message finally landed, I need to talk to you before court. A second message, are you sure you want this to be public? I looked at the locket on the table, opened it, touched our faces, the hinge, the way it let something open without breaking. Truth is public by nature, I wrote back. Then I added, I'm still your sister either way. No typing bubbles came. Only the harbor, steady beyond my window, reminding me that tides are stubborn but also reliable. The paper had spoken. It didn't shout. It didn't need to. It set a chair in the room and waited for everyone to sit down. The courtroom was small enough to feel like a meeting, large enough to hold pride. It smelled faintly of polish and old books. Light struck the wood railing and turned it the color of tea. Lucas sat at the petitioner's table in his best gray suit, the one he wore for job interviews and once for a wedding he didn't want to attend. He didn't look at me at first. When he did, I recognized the boy who thought good behavior could rewind the day and the man who had learned the limits of that belief. Oliver's voice was a tide, measured, periodic, unhurried. He submitted the avuncular DNA report and my father's codicil. He didn't dwell on the rumor mill or the lock on the door. He anchored his remarks in the language judges respect, probabilities, compliance, intent. Our aunt, in a navy dress that made her look like a lighthouse, testified to our family as if she were reading a recipe for bread she'd baked 1,000 times. My brother never differentiated between them, she said, gesturing to Luca and me. He called them both my children when he was tired and forgot how to count. Luca's attorney stood and tried to frame the issue as preservation of property, as urgency, as the peril of a contested will being executed too soon. The judge, a woman with eyes that missed nothing and a mouth that protected everything it knew, asked softly, preservation from whom? The silence had weight. The attorney shuffled papers, found a sentence, and retreated. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't recite my childhood like an alibi. I talked about locks and kitchens and the naming of rooms. I explained how grief changes the color of facts. He loved us, I said, and my voice didn't crack, it settled. He took me to the pier at dawn and taught me how to watch the weather in the water when the sky lied. He taught Luca to splice rope and told him that strength is the neatness of a knot, not only its tightness. I lifted the locket and held it in my palm so the chain draped like a tiny shoreline. If the law requires paper, I have paper. But it also has to recognize a life lived in plain sight. The judge nodded the way people do when they are adding pieces to a scale you can't see. She looked to Luca. Mr. Dove, she said, do you have any factual evidence to rebut the DNA report or the codicil? Luca stood, and the cavern of all the words we hadn't said yawned between us. He didn't look at me. No factual evidence, he said, voice smooth with exhaustion. Only a feeling I couldn't shake. Stories I heard. Things that made sense when the house went quiet. He paused. I was wrong to change the locks without an order. I thought I was protecting our father's things. Maybe I was protecting my fear. The judge's gaze didn't soften or harden, it stayed exactly where justice lives. The court grants Ms. Dove immediate access to the property, she said, her voice like a clean edge. The petition to remove her as a beneficiary is denied, with prejudice. The filing includes statements that meet the threshold for reckless disregard. Pursuant to the codicil, the discretionary portion of personal property is redirected to the community trust for 12 months. She turned to both of us. This ruling is a legal answer, not a family one. I hope you find that second answer elsewhere. Outside, the air tasted of rain. The florist downstairs had shifted buckets of lilies closer to the door, and their perfume stepped into the hall like a guest who knew she belonged. Oliver shook my hand and, in that brief, dry press. I felt everything he had held for us so we didn't have to. My aunt kissed my temple and whispered, "Now go home." Luca waited at the foot of the stairs, jaw slack with something he might never say. We stood there with the street yawning like a river. Cars hissed. A woman laughed into her phone. It was astonishing, again, how ordinary the world insists on being while your own feels reorganized. "I thought if I kept the house still," he said finally, "I could keep him still. I thought maybe I'd walk in and he'd be sitting in his chair, asking where I put the tape measure." He looked at me then. "When people said, about you, something in me wanted to punish the story before it punished me. It felt like protecting him, somehow. I'm sorry, Mara. There are apologies that want to be absolutions and apologies that want to be doors. This one felt like a door waiting to be opened from both sides. I sent you the report," I said gently, "because facts are a kind of comfort. You saw it." "I saw it," he said. "You're our father's daughter." "Of course you are." I knew that even while I was saying the wrong thing. Maybe because saying otherwise made the ache move away, for a second. We walked to the house together. He unlocked the door with the new key and set it on the little dish just inside, the one our mother bought at a yard sale begging for more uses. The smell of cedar slapped my heart and then held it softly. I went to the kitchen and pressed my palm to the copper pot. He stood in the doorway with his hand skimming the frame as if measuring it. "Judge was right," he said. "We still need the family answer." "Maybe we can bake it," I said, and for a heartbeat we were 12 again, stealing cookies cooling on racks, getting caught by the smell. We walked through the rooms and made a list of urgent repairs like two responsible adults who had just remembered they were responsible. In the back studio, the sunlight made a grid on the floor. Luca reached into his pocket and pulled out the old lock cylinder. "You want it?" he asked. "As a souvenir of a bad idea." "I want to melt it down and make a bell that rings whenever one of us lets fear be louder than love," I said, and we both smiled, because bells are fussy and expensive and this was a metaphor. Still, we kept the cylinder on the windowsill. A small metal reminder of what a house should never be. The first night back in the house, I slept in my old room and the wind moved the curtains the way it used to, as if the sea were breathing for me. Somewhere in the middle of the dark, I heard Luca's quiet footsteps in the hall. He paused outside my door, long enough to erase some of the distance we'd drawn. The day had placed a legal frame around a picture we already knew. The rest would be painting, and that was slower work. In the weeks that followed, life didn't return to normal, it found a new normal that fit like a sweater worn in. The community trust received a modest donation via my father's clause, and one afternoon I watched two teenagers in two big life vests coil lines under the eye of an old sailor who had once taught my father. I wanted to tell them the rope they were touching came from a quarrel that never had to be as mean as it was. Instead, I kept that tender mouth closed and clapped when their coils lay neat as sleeping snakes. Inside the house, we made it livable again. Luca fixed the window that always stuck in the spring. I oiled the hinges that had complained about time. We let the porch light welcome us home at dawn and dusk, because habit can be a kindness when your head is tired of thinking. On Sundays, my aunt drove down with a pie and asked us to take her to the harbor so she could point at boats and give them new names. We pretended not to notice when her eyes found the one our father loved and went somewhere else. One evening, I found the old fish stew card and cooked it in the copper pot. The scent rose slow and sure, onions surrendering, tomatoes turning sweet, garlic making the air carry its own light. Luca set the table. We ate quietly, as if noise might scare off the part of grief that had agreed to lie down and rest. After, he brought a small tin to the table and pushed it across to me. Inside was the locket's twin, another oval, scratched and perfect. He had found it in our father's nightstand. "He kept one for you and one for me," Luca said. "He just never gave me mine. He opened it to reveal our mother's photo lined up with his. The hinge worked, the chain held. I thought I wasn't ready. I think I am now. We didn't speak about the year-long diversion of property to the trust beyond budgeting for it like weather. When a chair leg broke, we fixed it instead of buying a new chair. When the roof leaked, we put out a pot and then called someone who could teach us how to patch it. It felt, strangely, like honoring our father's belief that skill is a kind of grace. The bell we joked about, the one I wanted to cast from the bad lock, never materialized. But sometimes, when one of us started to talk from fear, the other would tap the windowsill where the cylinder sat and say, "Ding." It was ridiculous. It worked. The DNA report lived in the file cabinet, labeled but not laminated into our daily speech. It had done its job. I understood now that paper is a tool, not a home. Home was the porch where I drank tea and watched the harbor decide whether to be blue or pewter. Home was the hallway runner that did look like a river if you turned your head and let your eyes soften. Home was Lucas sitting on the floor with a screwdriver in his teeth, muttering about soft screws like they were a category of moral failure. I wrote a letter, not to Luca, though maybe someday I will, but to my mother. I wrote it in the studio with the morning light laid out like a map and folded it carefully when I finished. I used to think belonging was something you could misplace, I wrote. Now I know it's something you practice. I'm practicing. I slid the letter under the sugar tin where we kept good notes. The tin had become a small altar to the way ordinary things hold us together, sugar for guests, notes for later, a place to hide the life that needs time to ripen. On the first day of autumn, I planted a ginkgo sapling by the quince. The nursery tag said it was stubborn and slow, that it would survive city air, salt air, the kind of winters that make you consider moving. I liked its odds. I knelt in the dirt and pressed the roots down and thought of my father's watch buried nearby, ticking nowhere and everywhere. Luca joined me with the hose, stage whispering advice as if the tree needed to be charmed into drinking. The water made the soil a darker, truer color. I leaned back on my heels and wiped my hands on my jeans. The harbor was busy, cranes pacing, a tug murmuring like someone soothing a child. "Do you forgive me?" he asked, not looking up, as if the hose were a snake he had to watch. "I'm repairing with you," I said. "Forgiveness is in there somewhere." He nodded, and we both understood that some words need to be planted and watered before they can shade anyone. When the first ginkgo leaf went gold, it looked like a small fan, like something you'd use to cool yourself in a crowded room. I plucked it and set it inside my locket where our faces lived on either side. The hinge closed without complaint. Later, I stood at the kitchen window with the copper pot drying on the rack and the porch light ready to wake. The house breathed around me the way it always had when I remembered to listen, wood settling, the faint clock thrum of someone walking upstairs, which was just the pipes deciding to be chatty. The law had spoken and was finished with us. The family part was quieter and ongoing. Some nights, I lay in my old room and felt a kid again, wondering if the morning would bring wind or stillness. Most mornings, it brought both, the kind of day my father liked best because it made sailors pay attention. We were paying attention now. To the difference between rumor and truth, between caution and cruelty, between a lock that keeps danger out and a lock that locks your own heart. I don't know if the harbor makes families or only shelters them. But as the ginkgo took root and the quince fattened and the house kept its cedar breath, I stopped needing to know. I belonged here because I kept showing up, because we kept choosing the slow work, because love, as my mother said and my father proved, is older than blood and better company in the long run. I ran a hand along the windowsill where the old lock cylinder sat and gave it one last gentle tap. "Ding," I whispered. Luca laughed in the other room. The bell we never cast rang anyway, exactly where we needed it to.